Welcome to the mayhem. Dick and Lloyd mayhem. Media mayhem. Marketing a mayhem. You might love it, you might hate it. It's my favorite freaking show.
Welcome back to another Dick and Loy Media and Marketing Mayhem show. This time, we sit down with a legendary restaurant guy, Joe Wilcox, who handled Plaza III, the Bristol, and many more of your favorites from the past. If you've been to a restaurant in town or are a restaurant owner now, you'll want to see what both Joe and Loy say about who's doing it right and what's wrong with a few of them, and the memories of eating places long gone. We'll get started with Joe in a moment, but as you know, those political ads are popping up everywhere.
Hi, I'm Loy Edge, candidate for president of the Podcast Association, and I would really appreciate your vote. My opponent, Dick Wilson, is not a good candidate and can't be trusted. Where does he stand on women's issues? He stands alone. In his own family, he has been accused of leaving the lid up 6 times. Is this what we want as a leader? An accused 6-time toilet stool seat lever upper? I don't think so. If you think you know the real Dick Wilson, you don't know Dick. I'm Loy Edge, and I approve this message.
Hi, I'm Dick Wilson, and I'm running for president of the Podcast Association. I stand for quality and creativity in the execution of podcasting. My opponent, Loy Edge, is a man who cannot be trusted. He once left a clothing store on the plaza, followed by a young lady shopper, and did not hold the door for her. Radical, socialist, and an admitted cigar smoker. Not what the association needs in these times of parliamentarianism.
Mr. Wilson, I don't believe that's the word you want to use here.
Just run it the way it is. As long as the TV station's making money, they'll run it. Well, Loy, we're back in our old stomping grounds, Diebel's Cigar Club again.
Good to be in the old squishy, comfortable leather chairs again.
Who's this sitting across from us here?
Well, it looks like Joe Wilcox, who is somebody that if you've been you've gotten out of the house in the last 40 years, you've gone out for any dinner or drinks, you probably are familiar with Joe Wilcox. How are you, Joe?
I'm doing great.
Joe, why would we know you? Where would we have seen you last, do you think?
The longest tenure at Plaza III was there from 1990 to 2007.
Okay. All right.
Came into town in 1979 with the Rusty Scupper, which was downtown at 14th and Jefferson.
That was fun.
Boy, there's a name you don't remember, but boy.
Well, that was the first new restaurant built downtown, I think, in God knows how many years. But the bit of the history, it opened the night the plaza flooded.
Oh, yeah.
So it was September 13th or 12th or 13th.
And that was the great Ludwell Gaines that opened that, wasn't it?
Ludwell was the landlord, and the downtown believers. And it was funny because when they opened up Power and Light, I moved here in 79, they opened the Scupper in 77. And I said, you're right on Kansas City time. You're opening this thing 30 years later than they said they would. Which was, at the time, it was like, okay, all the work was being done outside of town and everybody was trying to get downtown redone. But in fact, when I flew into Kansas City in 79 was the night the Kemper roof collapsed.
Well, my gosh.
I know, I've got like all these...
Let me think here. What's going on with Joe Wilcox?
I think I'm going back to Chicago.
Flew in town and there was one of those western storms coming. I'm landing going, what in the world is this? Wake up the next morning, Kemper roof had collapsed.
Good golly. Wow.
So you were there at the beginning, or not the very beginning, but you came in to do the Scupper.
Yep, did the Scupper and then worked for them downtown till 85. Then in 1985 went to work for Gilbert Robinson and ran Bristol for 2 years. And then
Bristol on the Plaza, a real stalwart.
Bristol, which Paul Robinson always said was one of the best he ever did.
Mm-hmm, I'd agree.
He loved that place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was such a classic. Ran Fedora and then Plaza III.
So what happened with Plaza III? That's the most recent restaurant to make a pretty big change in the area. So
I think just evolution. I mean, they brought in Capitol Grill. They brought in, Ruth's Chris, which has come and gone. The steakhouse business has changed.
Miss the salad and the crackers.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think
I think it is. I mean, just what's going in there to replace the old Plaza III is a pretty good example of how things have changed, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
That wouldn't have stood a flying chance.
True Foods is, it's a lighter concept, younger demographic. One of the big things is going to be that, Oprah's has bought into this company, and it's probably going to be a monster. But it's a different style of dining. But they do a nice job. Good operators.
Yeah.
When you got into the business, and that was back in the 80s, a lunch was still kind of an event.
I started in the 70s bartending and waiting tables, and lunch was huge. It was one of those big day parts, a lot of business lunch, a lot of, bartending during the day, you'd serve 60, 70, 80, 90 Bloody Marys and people having cocktails and drink. It was before wine even blew up. But
that's right.
Wine really started in the 80s. That's when wine took over. But before that, it was mostly, cocktails and martinis and, beers. And then wine just all of a sudden exploded. That's when everybody started developing these wine lists. In fact, Gilbert Robinson was on the front side of that because they were one of the first ones to get in buying futures through Plaza III to buy the French wines and bring in French wine. And I remember when I worked for the Scupper, we'd go out to Napa and we did a wine tasting, and Robert Mondavi was one of the guys doing the tasting for us. Mr. Robert Mondavi. But that was a California company, so that was right when Napa was really starting to blow up in the mid-70s. And
well, that was the beginning of that awakening in the wine world. Definitely people were drinking Mateus Rosé and Blue Nun.
I've got the original menus from Plaza III from 1964, and it was Lancers, Mateus, and then Blue Nun got on there somewhere along the line.
Yeah.
It was all carafes of wine to begin with, box wine, and everybody was selling Inglenook, and then all of a sudden it just took this quantum leap forward. But
yes. Well, as I used to say as I went into a restaurant back then, take this away and bring me something wrapped in straw.
Exactly. And amazingly, Gilbert Robinson was on the front edge, but to the best list, actually 3 in the city now, is when Cliff Bath started it with Harry Starkers, they were the first one to get the grand award from the Wine Spectator. So Cliff was on the front side of that, but Cliff was from Santa Rosa, California. Came to work he was originally went to Oklahoma State, was at the Golden Ox, and then was the original manager at Plaza III. So when he bought Starkers, it was the old Trail Winds or Trail Ridge.
Trade Winds? I don't know.
It was an old restaurant that Cliff bought, and he put Harry Starkers in there, and he and his nephew named Bob Bath, who now works for one of the wineries in California, was the one that came in and built his wine program. And Cliff grew up in the wine country, so he knew it. And then after that, Jimmy Francais with JJ's built his list, and he got the grand award. And so you've got these 2 small restaurants in Kansas City that are internationally recognized because of their wine list.
So do you get your award only because of the labels that you stock, or how does that award come about?
It's all about, one, building a list and having the inventories and keeping the stuff in stock, because if they, in fact, some of the stores, Cliff would go, they wouldn't sell certain wines because they said, we got to have this on our list, because if the wine inspector comes in and we don't have it, then it looks like we're just writing a list for the notoriety, because there's people that write wine lists, there are other guys that sell wine, and and it's all part of the recognition. It's like being a restaurant that's always out of your number one item.
Well, Cliff was a great marketer and understood how to position the place. They created a great environment, was really tuned into the zeitgeist of the time.
Oh, absolutely.
And like all those guys were that happened to emanate from, you were telling me, the Golden Ox.
Right. Well,
where the beginnings of that Paul Robinson influence.
Well, Jay Dillingham owned it, and I think and I don't know the whole genesis of it, but Bill Rauschenbach was the last owner, and then Steve Greer, who worked for Gilbert Robinson before it shut down. But Jay Dillingham owned it. Paul Robinson came in and ran it. He went to Oklahoma State also, so that's where Cliff Bath and PR had both gone to Oklahoma State. But when Paul Robinson left, Paul Robinson, Ken Hill, who became president of Gilbert Robinson, and he also worked at the Golden Ox, and then Cliff Bass. So there was, talk about rock stars. And they
I don't think a lot of people know that pedigree.
Oh, I'm sure.
I wasn't aware that everybody from all the heavy hitters from Gilbert Robinson came out of the Golden Ox, which is now making a
comeback,
a rebirth, as is, I guess, Plaza III. So
supposedly,
that's what I understand.
Now, Sam Wilson's was GR also, wasn't
Correct.
it? I have a big history at Sam Wilson's because we came out from the radio stations and did Wednesday night dance parties for years at Sam Wilson's around town. So
probably remember the one at 103rd.
103rd, Nolan Road. Yes, yes.
They'd shut down most of them by the time I started with them in '85. But they started with the Inn at the Landing, Sam Wilson's. Wow. They built 100 West was their club. It was now where Annie Santa Fe used to be, and I think it's Zoe's.
Right. Yeah, it's a Mediterranean place.
100 West was when after the Plaza flood in '77. That's when they put Annie Santa Fe in. So then they built the Annie's out in Oak Park Mall. They had the Annie's at Bannister Mall, and then there was one up on Antioch.
So years and years of working and managing restaurants and things. What are some of the things you learned that you might pass along to someone who is just coming into the industry? Even though the industry's changed, what did you learn during your years?
Well, the one thing that hasn't changed is that restaurants really are one of the last places where you're going to deal with real live human beings. When somebody calls, we have people answering the phones. It's not message machines. When you make a reservation, in fact, I have people, I'd pick up the phone, they go, "What are you doing to answer the phone?" I said, "It was ringing." They're so used to not having people. And
however, I have tried restaurants now that say, "Oh, well, hello, yes, well, you can do that online. Would you make your reservation online, please?"
Isn't that the worst?
Yeah.
It's like, just take my reservation. Well, you can go to Open Table. I'm like, I don't want to go to Open Table. I want to come to you. And the biggest difference is that they've taken the personality and the humanity out of some of this stuff. It's become just like, here come the numbers. We'll take care of the numbers and call it a day. I had guests that used to come to Plaza III and said, "Joe, the reason we come down here is because you're the only person in town that knows who we are." Guy says, "I've spent over $1 million in Kansas City restaurants over 50 years.
Wow, yeah.
You think about it. And he goes, "Nobody knows who I am." But that was where restaurateurs like Paul Robinson and Cliff Bath and, you look at Victor Fontana and all the guys that have been around, Stephen Malloy over at Classic Cup knew everybody. We all knew everybody. You had to.
Talk to me about an old restaurant downtown called Eddie's. What do you know about that?
Most of their restaurants had shut down by the time I got here, but I know Leroy Eddy and A.G. Eddy and the Eddy family. And at one time, and some of the great stories that they would tell was that Eddie's had Eddie's nightclub downtown, where I think the Stuart Title is there now, down across from the University Club. But at one time, they were bringing in international talent that were just this Eddie's nightclub. And then they opened the Loafensteins and things like that. But they still do caterings. They do a huge catering business. They've got, but they're a great restaurant family, and they're fun stories. In fact, Leroy Eddy, who's a friend, told me that originally it was Milliman's was the first restaurant where Plaza III was. Then it was Wolferman's. And then when Mr. Wolferman was going out, they were negotiating with the Eddy family. Mr. Nichols was negotiating with the Eddy family to take that location and put an Eddie's in there. And Leroy said his father told him, he says, "We'll do it, but we're not paying any percentage rent."
Oh, yeah.
So when he wrote the lease, Mr. Eddy went in and saw the lease. Said they had thrown a percentage rent clause in there. And Mr. Eddy said, "We're done. We're not doing this."
Now, for those of you who aren't into the knowledge, what is a percentage rent clause in a deal?
Oh, they've got a base rent, and then after X number of sales, it's usually 6 or 7, 7%, 8% over X. So most people want a base rent. Most landlords want a percentage rent after you hit a base number. So they're always paying rent no matter what happens.
Sure.
Well, not a lot of people know that J.C. Nichols was really the pioneer in percentage rent. He was the guy who kind of started that.
Now, does every store on the plaza, do you think, have a percentage rent?
I don't know if they
I don't
even
know
do
anymore.
that anymore.
That was one of the things about Mr. Nichols when they started, and one of the great descriptions Barry Brady told me one time. He says when Mr. Nichols it was an incubator company. They'd put people in business, and they'd say, okay, here's your rent, but if you do this much sales, then we get a percentage of it. And that way he could put people into the base rent. As they were more successful, they got more. The rents went up, which made sense.
It made sense because there was a big. It was important for them to maintain that exclusivity and to be able to nurture these startups. They knew that they had a success story that they owned and had exclusives on because they had such a broad investment in the whole community, the whole surrounding area, that they could make that kind of investment in people, I think.
And they invested, and you're right, they invested in not only they didn't invest just in the stores and the real estate, they invested in the people and they helped develop that. And that's what kept people down here for years, whether it was, you look at where you had Swanson's, you had Absolute Florist was down here for years, and Fireside.
Lori Owens.
Sure.
And a lot of the places that came in, they were able to, when they brought in Parkway 600, Forbes Cross and Mike Eastwood, they had reasonable rent, but they had a high upside. So as everybody prospered, so did the Nichols Company. In fact, when Highwoods took over, they said one of the issues they ran into was because there were so many percentage rent deals, they couldn't sell any of the leases because nobody knew what the rents were. And that's why they stopped doing a lot of these percentage rent leases. It's like $40 a square foot, $30 a square foot, and they started throwing numbers on it. So if you had 10,000 square feet, your rent was going to be, $300,000 a year, $25,000 a month, because then they could sell the mortgage, or sell the lease.
Right, they had
which was one of those. I never knew that.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that contract is collateral.
Absolutely, and they said that was one of the problems they had, was that they couldn't collateralize the loans or the leases because nobody knew what it was going to be worth.
That makes sense.
Can you guys, between the two of you, and I know you guys work together, we'll talk about that in a minute, in consulting restaurants and things. You guys remember Top of the Tower at Commerce Towers? The restaurants that were up there had the cobblestone walkway down through the middle and the different restaurant themes. And
that had closed by the time I'd gotten there, but June Holtorf, who was our lead hostess at Plaza III and worked at Plaza III from the time it opened, she was one of the managers and hosts that was down there at that time.
Okay, sure.
She was there forever, and she was one of the reasons Plaza III was famous, because she knew everybody.
Yeah,
And
here's
everybody
my story from that restaurant. Had dinner one time in the French restaurant section, I think, and ordered what I thought was teriyaki steak, but it was steak tartare. And I think I had a date that night, so I had to struggle through it.
Oh my God.
You had to wash that down with some of that Matisse Rosé.
Bring me something in straw.
Well, it's funny because you bring up, you talk about, and again, it was closed by the time I got here, but, putting all those different concepts on one floor in one restaurant where you can go. And it was so far ahead of its time.
I think there's a law firm up there now, because I delivered lunch up there once through the radio station and looked out over that window that looks into the Northland,
Oh,
so,
yeah.
gosh.
It tells you how far ahead of things, Gilbert Robinson was at the time. In fact, Mr. Gilbert, Joe Gilbert, and True Milliman were partners, and they ran the Four Winds up at KCI.
Oh, yeah.
They started doing, as planes were coming through, they started doing box lunches for people. Can I get something to go? They make box lunches for people, and off they'd go. And that's how they started with the airline feeding, because they were one of the first to start feeding people on airplanes.
So there was so much innovative stuff coming out of Kansas City in the industry. Starting out those airline boxes and the whole idea of that casual dining market that the baby boomers embraced. It's a chicken and egg thing, but when the boomers became 21 years of age, suddenly restaurants had a different purpose, and GR was right there in that innovation and creating that market, basically.
You're right. All of a sudden, all these casual places opened up, who were good dinner houses, but they were hiring guys to wait tables, and we wore rugby shirts and tennis shoes, and it was great fun. And then all of a sudden, you're either a waiter in a fine dining restaurant, which nobody wanted to do that. We didn't have the experience. But then all of a sudden the casual concepts opened up and everybody became waiters and bartenders, and it just blew up.
That's right. And you were either a bar that served food or you were a restaurant that had a bar. But really this was a new hybrid kind of a thing where the bar was a big part of the concept. Like you take a Houlihan's, for example. Great big gorgeous bar was the centerpiece of it, and yeah, you could go get some food over here in the non-smoking area or go to the main area. I mean, as
they continued to evolve, I mean, they became, like when I started with the Scupper, they said we sell food, liquor, and he says entertainment. He says we're in the entertainment business, and that was one of the things that always stuck with me, because people go, you can get a meal anywhere, and now it's evolved to where now the description is home meal replacement. It says I'm going out, I can cook or I can go out.
Right.
But there are very few places where you go for a real experience to say, okay, what's going to be unique and what's going to make it special.
Let's talk about unique for a moment. I'm going to throw another history restaurant out and see what you guys remember about it. The Monastery in Brookside.
Yeah, that was
what was the deal with that? Monks going around serving cheese and wine and sandwiches?
They were in the forefront of the wine deal. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, that one was there a short time, but that was Joe D. Was Joe D. running that one, or?
Well, the Listers.
That's right, Dennis Lister
had it.
And he's still around town. I don't see him much.
Yeah, I haven't either, but he did have quite a place there, I think. It's one of the first places where there was a focus on wine, and the List was, of course, at the forefront of that concept, and they dressed like monks.
Oh, I remember walking in there, and the guys were walking. It was dead quiet. There was like everybody whispering and it's like this, only darker with no windows. And then you had guys walking around monks. It was almost kind of eerie.
It was.
Well, it was one of the few restaurants you could go to in town and get a splinter.
Well, that was. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's so fun. Everybody listening who's been to that place, it's not one of those top of mind experiences, but I'm telling you, if you went in there, you remember. You might even remember where you were sitting, because it was just such a weird deal.
Well, and the fun part about it was those were the places that really got traction because they were so unique. This is way too fun. I mean, it's like you've said, who in the world would have thought the Happy Buzzard would be there almost 50 years?
That's right.
I mean, it's like Kelly's and the Buzzard are the two places that have lasted the longest in Westport.
That's right, and Happy Buzzard was the place that was the first contemporary sort of thing after the Alley. It was a little dive bar, and then Hal and Gary and all those guys got together and they built the Happy Buzzard, and then I bartended there, and it closed. It became two other concepts that were both short-lived, and it was completely different. It had Formica floors, it had paneling, it was nothing at all like the Happy Buzzard. And then your friend and old GR cohort Bob Reagan and we went in and re-buzzardized it.
And it became
Buzzard Beach.
Buzzard Beach.
Yes. I don't know when that was exactly, but it was a long time ago. It seemed like maybe 80, I don't know, maybe 81 or something. But that was probably the largest rebuzzardization project ever in Kansas City.
Well, it's funny because you talk about, Dan Hogarty, who's still in town, and his father, Mr. Hogarty, they had a Hogarty's downtown, and that's where the St. Patrick's Day Parade started. And, the first St. Patrick's Day Parade went from Hogarty's to Italian Gardens and back, and they said that was it.
We actually interviewed Pat O'Neill a while back, and he told us all the inside scoop on all that and how and why that happened.
I'm sure.
It's elsewhere on our podcast selection.
Go to the Pat O'Neill interview for more information.
Now, you guys are working together. Talk to me about what you guys are attempting to do together here for the restaurant industry.
Well, we for a large amount of money, we will go drink in your place and then go home.
Okay, basically. All right. And jot down suggestions on the napkin.
That's right, and we'll deliver them loudly.
Okay, well, that's good.
At the end of the night. No, what we're doing is We are working mainly with financiers, banks, and real estate companies who have a lot of bar and restaurant tenants that may be in need of some turnaround expertise. I mean, that's one of the main areas that we focus on is doing turnarounds. And Joe has extensive experience in all aspects of the operations, and we have a lot of overlapping in how we look at personnel issues and marketing and things like that. And then we work together on positioning, helping them determine is the concept that's in here right for what the market is. And Joe, talk about it a little bit.
Well, I think there's so many restaurants that have opened up and they've got a good idea, but they just, it's the old question, I think it's Mary Kay Cosmetics, what's more important, the idea or the execution? Everybody gets an idea, but they don't know how to execute it. And, having given our backgrounds, one thing, Paul Robinson, one of the things he always said, because everybody said, I remember this so distinctly, he said, everybody says the three most important things are location, location, location. And Paul Robinson said the three most important things are execute the concept, execute the concept, execute the concept. And, most guys, they look at it and they see a dartboard, they throw the dart for the bullseye and they hit the right wall because they don't know what they're trying to do. And so they're chasing everybody. Instead of focusing on what they want to be, they chase trends and everything else. And there's so many restaurants out there, just there's 1,000 little things that they don't see. Yeah,
and 1,000 little things is a good way to put it, because really through experienced eyes, and when you work the winners, you've had losers, and you've had to do turnarounds, and you've been in chaotic places that needed to be fixed, and you've built things from the bottom up. All these things require thousands of tiny decisions. And when you go into a place where they've made most of those decisions correctly, it's right. It just feels right. You want to be there. You want to return. All the things that are important are taken care of. You're relaxed. And many people won't understand or even be able to identify what's wrong when the decisions have not been made right, but you don't feel like, you really want to go back to that place.
Well, it's a unique concept because you guys are representing the people who hold the rental agreements with these people and want to keep them in that location.
Well, that's important, Joe. Joe will agree with this because we talked about this. It's very difficult to find clients that you can help who are independent restaurateurs. Because if they're in a lot of trouble, things aren't working right, they're not going to spend the money to get help. They kind of go down with the ship usually eventually, and if they are surviving, a lot of times they really don't know what they're leaving on the table, and they don't know they need assistance. So to work with somebody who has a vested interest in their success to the point where they can say, wow, you really need to talk to these guys because you're not performing. This isn't going to go well.
Well, and it's I read an analogy one time, guy says, if you've got to lose in restaurants, it's the equivalent of driving a Porsche into the lake every month, because the losses just multiply so fast that it's just like, and especially big restaurants. I mean, you look at, when we started out, the restaurant day, you break it down into day parts. If you're open from 11 in the morning till 11 at night, doing 90% of your business, you had a 12-hour day. Well, now you've got maybe a 4-hour day because people will go from, you might be able to do a little bit of lunch business 11 to 1, and then you're doing 90% of your dinner business from 6 to 8. And, it's like your guys' radio business. You look at the arbitrons, it's like, okay, when's drive time? It's like jink, jink, and that's probably the 80-20 rule says 80% of your business comes at 20% of your time.
Sure.
Same thing for restaurants. If there's a 12-hour, and it's funny because people always say, wow, this place is really busy. And I go, there's 168 hours in the week. Most restaurants are busy for about 20. It's that other 148 that's going to kill you.
Sure,
And so,
And then add to that stress if you've got a swing area that's outside and you're in a market like Kansas City where you've got a lot of days that aren't going to work for the outside area, but you have to keep it staffed, and you got to get service to those tables. And on a beautiful night, if you double your capacity, on a bad night, there are a lot of people that are getting that call that they're not needed to come in that night, and that puts a lot of stress on the operation.
And it is. It's still, like I said, it's a people business. It's people, like Mr. Gilbert always said. He says we're ordinary people doing an extraordinary job, and and that's what you always wanted to, make sure you had was get great people doing a great job, and that hasn't changed.
No.
The most successful restaurants are the ones where they're totally focused on the guests.
Who is doing it right in town right now at this moment, do you think? Has any names come to?
Well, the two guys that were just restaurateurs of the year this year were Andy Locke and Donald Malloy from Summit Grill, and they've got a great little company they've built. Both worked for McCormick and Schmick, and came through.
Is that the Summit Grill out on 291 Highway?
291, and then they've got the one. They've got 3rd Street Social in Lee Summit. They've got Summit Grill, and they just opened Pearl out in Lee Summit.
Okay.
But they're doing it. You look at some of the restaurateurs that are out there. James Westfall in Westport with Char Bar, and
yeah, that's an interesting thing. It's got a
those
lot
guys
going
have created
for it.
some excitement in Westport, and they've got 4 concepts going there now, I think.
And that when you ask that question about if they're doing it right, there's so many different elements to these places. Some of them excel in the food area. Some of them know how to create a great bar atmosphere. So there are a lot of people that are doing part of it right, but to get everything running together, that's quite a trick.
Yeah, and there's a lot of there's a lot of good small restaurateurs. Kevin Timmons with Nick and Jake's, and you've got, even Kevin Ryan has just got Governor Stumpy's, a small little place over in Waldo. There's a lot of, the Kelly brothers are still doing a great job with what they do. And
Greg Johnson
with,
really,
you start talking about all the guys in town that have been doing it for years and years that are the independent guys. And the hardest thing in our business is being the independent guy competing with these national chains. He said, I had a guest in Wichita that always said he used to race against Roger Penske, and he said, I would sit and look at my car and I'd talk about cubic inches, and Roger Penske's looking at cubic dollars. He says, I knew I couldn't compete with him.
Yeah.
And it's the same for restaurants. The local guy comes in and says, okay, I got $300,000, $400,000 I can spend to build a restaurant. These companies that come into the Plaza, we can spend $5-6 million. You're going like, oh.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of great independent restaurateurs that, have so much history in this town, and like I mentioned Carl DiCapo earlier. He's still out there, and he was actually the one responsible for getting the World War I monument built, but he's been so involved in the community for so many years that there's a legacy there that's just brilliant.
And that was really a classic place that he had before all this baby boomer era.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That's where my parents' age, many nights, the Chow Lounge.
Is this Italian Gardens?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
That was where there was a time, and I contend it was before women entered the workplace, before the jig was up and everything got exposed. There was a conspiracy of males who, but it only consisted of about everybody who was in the sales or executive role at a company, was having drinks in some Italian restaurant at noon, eating one of those shredded salads with maybe one piece of purple and maybe one little tomato in it, but three martinis or scotches or bourbons, and smoking cigarettes at the table.
Okay.
And they had the Chow Lounge, and that was the center of the universe, I think, for quite a while.
Wow.
My mom's 91, and people said, she says they were talking about watching Mad Men, and my mom goes, I don't need to watch Mad Men.
Right.
I lived Mad Men. She said, my father was an executive, and those guys, talk about, she talked about Studebaker, said if you were a secretary at Studebaker, you had to wear high heels. She's like, hey. So it's like, oh my God. So it's a different world.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, talk about the center of the universe. Some of these places just do a lot of, I would say that in the 80s, Fedora, or maybe the 90s.
85 opened.
It was really the 90s when it caught its big cog, probably early 90s. But that place for quite a while was kind of the center of the universe, wouldn't you say?
Oh yeah, it was like the face place in Kansas City.
Yeah.
And it was the place that taught Kansas City how to, instead of, we're not drinking drinks, we're drinking cocktails.
That's right.
And Joyce Angelos was the wine supervisor, and they had some great bartenders.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was like the face place in Kansas City because it wasn't the dark, smoky. Bristol was the party place and this great energy, but Fedora was the sophisticated place where everybody.
And they were running on all cylinders. They were cranking out wine, liquor, everything at the bar. Bar was really busy, and then the dining. They had a strong.
Oh yeah, it was
strong program there too.
And
Bristol was the same.
It was one of the first chef-driven restaurants that the chef came in and they created the menus, and you had at that time you had venue that opened up with Dennis Kaniger and Gabriel, up on Main Street, and Steve Cole, when he opened Cafe Allegro, he took it to another level as far as food. I mean, he was like,
that was 39th Street.
Yep, Steve was brilliant.
Where did the restaurants go where the violinist stepped up to your table and played a song? The strolling violinist. That's what I remember, because I have a Pooch's 210 story. I was on a double date with the friends that introduced me to my wife, and we went to Pooch's 210. And when I got the bill, my friend and I had to go into the men's room and say, "Do we have enough money to get out of here?"
Well, I told Loy a story the other day. When I was running Plaza III, I put in a prom menu, or prom and homecoming, because we get all the kids would come in. And I was walking through the restaurant, and this guest goes, "You the manager?" "Yep." "Come here." He says, "See that table of 4 with her?" "Yep." He says, "Buy him dinner." He says, "Tell him it's from a guy in a sweater." It was homecoming. It's in October. So I took care of them and went over and told the kids, they ordered, and dinner's been taken care of by a guy in a sweater. The kids leave, said thanks. I said, okay. I went over and said, the kid said thank you. And I said, can I sit down? He goes, yeah. I said, okay, tell me this story. He says, when I was in high school, my parents didn't have a lot of money. He says, I had to go to homecoming with my in a sweater. I couldn't afford a sport coat. He says, but I looked over and saw those kids sitting there, and the kids sitting there with the menu at Plaza III just shaking. Which goes back to what you're talking about.
Right, there you go.
And I went, wait a minute, okay, these kids want to come here. It was the special occasion restaurant in Kansas City.
Right.
And so we put a menu in. It was $25, all in, tax tip, everything, beverage, dessert, because these kids were just petrified coming in, but they wanted to go to a special place. And so we do that for homecoming and proms. And I told Loy, I said, at one point, I counted up, and we had kids from 80 different high schools come in for prom one season. And the fun part about it was there weren't a lot of places for the kids to go back then. And so they would all come down here. I mean, it was like limos. They were down taking pictures. And I mean, it was like, here comes the fleet. And it was great.
Right.
And it was just saturation marketing, because we had everybody from all over the city. So I would tell my staff, this tells you that everybody in the city knows we're here.
Yeah.
And we've got to protect that.
Exactly.
And unfortunately, what happened was they stopped protecting it, and that's why it kind of went away.
I think one of the sad closings, at least for me and many people in town, was when the rotating restaurant at the top of the Hyatt closed. Right. Skies.
Yep.
I don't know how their food, was okay, and they had the Mile High Pie, but it was just a unique place to go in town that we don't really have.
And the thing was, they closed it right in the middle of dinner. They just turned off the key and stopped spinning.
You're done. Yeah. Or turned it up into high speed, and everybody got sick and got off.
Well,
it was a carny that did it.
Yeah, but you think about, and again, it's talk about different styles of dining, because they've closed Skies, they closed Benton's, they closed the American, they closed
Peppercorn Duck Club. I think Milano's is still there.
They closed the rooftop at the Alameda.
Yeah.
They closed the Pam Pam.
La Tour.
In fact, Kevin Pastilli, I visited with him a couple months ago, and I mean, talk about rock stars. I mean, there was Phil Pastilli and Bill Gilbert who.
That's right. Talk about those guys, because they were high flyers.
But they epitomized class. I mean, they walk in, Mr. Gilbert was, Mr. Robinson was that way. They'd walk in and you knew somebody special was in the room. But they were all partners. They helped, Mr. Pastilli helped build the Alameda, which is now the Intercontinental. And, his son Kevin and his daughter Cynthia, they still run the Marriott downtown. And
I interviewed Mr. Pastilli one time years ago, talking about his experiences of being in town when the Beatles came to town, and he had some great stories. Yeah,
I can imagine.
Well, they were cool guys.
Because he was running the he would have been running the Muehlebach at the time, so they probably stayed there, didn't
in the Muehlebach. Yeah,
my
sure.
God.
Mr. Gilbert and Mr. Robinson are no longer with us, but man, were they a class act all
three of them. I mean, I told Kevin, in fact, I said I always wish I would have been, because Mr. Gilbert, Bill Gilbert, and Phil Pastilli would always go to Palm Springs and vacation. I said I would have loved to have been in Palm Springs when those two were there, because they were two of the most elegant men you'd ever see, two of the smartest men you'd ever see. And I said, and I promise you, Frank Sinatra would have gotten out of their way, because I mean they were just they had that kind of presence.
Wow.
Now, that's me being provincial, but those guys were cool.
They were.
And
Cool.
Kevin's done, they've done a brilliant job downtown with that. He'd be fun to talk to, because
Oh yeah, I have every intention of getting Kevin on the Dick and Loy's Media and Marketing Mayhem.
Okay,
podcast.
sounds good. We've so many people to talk to in the future.
Great people in Kansas City.
I'm sorry, guys. Hold on a minute. I better get this. Yes, hello?
Hey, Dick, Buzz, Martini.
Oh, yeah, Buzz, the sales guy for our podcast. We're in the middle of an interview with Joe Wilcox. What's up?
Hey, listen, champ, something's come up here that's got me a little bit upset. Maybe you've heard about it.
What?
Got some people that are all up in arms. They're kind of boycotting the podcast.
What?
Which is hard enough selling this Dick and Loy's Media Mark, whatever the hell it is.
Okay.
I really don't need this, champ.
What's the deal?
Well, apparently some documents leaked out
Yeah.
where you apparently were inciting violence.
What?
Yes.
What?
Well, it looks like in your 7th grade class, you stuck a backslapper on some other kid that said, "Kick me."
Oh, come on.
And apparently this kid has come out and said, 40-some years later, granted, but he's come out, 50 years, but he's come out and said that he was traumatized by this.
Oh, come on.
So,
Come on.
I'd say we got a little problem. And Loy's not scot-free on this either.
What?
He apparently targeted rather violently with a projectile a child who was was 10 years old.
What?
Yes.
What do you mean?
Well, there's video, actually Super 8 black and white, no sound footage of this.
Yeah.
And it was, Loy was 9 years old at the time, but he made an effort to hit this kid violently with a projectile in a game of dodgeball.
What? Dodgeball? What, in gym class?
Fortunately, he missed, and the child,
Ugh.
escaped serious injury, but he's very upset and traumatized. So,
Well, all I can say.
so they're all boycotting your podcast.
This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, really.
Well,
It's.
we'll see you in the HR meeting, champ.
Oh.
Ciao.
Thank heavens we're not up for Supreme Court.
So the Plaza III, the name. Who were the Plaza III?
well, there were two different stories. One was the Plaza III was going to be Bill Gilbert, Joe Gilbert, and Paul Robinson.
That's what I heard.
And then Mr. Gilbert Mr. Robinson one time said, "We named it after the phone numbers, PL30000, Plaza 3.
I think.
And I went, I like the Bill
I
Gilbert.
think Bill
Joe
Gilbert told me the other story. Yeah.
No, but I think it was more in jest. He said, we named it after the phone number, but that was probably the greatest. I mean,
I wonder who's got that number now, Joe.
I don't know.
Everybody call Plaza 3.
Plaza 30000.
Rock.
I love that story, but it's funny because it was people say, "What's the phone number?" It's PL3, and they go, "What do you mean PL3?" I said, "Those are the old exchanges, folks." Because these kids don't know. It's like, "What do you mean PL3?" Plaza 3.
Any other great restaurants that aren't with us anymore? Locally oriented?
We mentioned 210. Starker's is gone. Savoy. They're trying to bring it back.
Savoy's trying to get back, yeah.
I think they
a little different.
There's just so many different types of places in town and they come and go.
Well, now we got the local barbecue places, which we always had, but they've
Right.
certainly expanded. And
Well, it's
got nationwide attention.
And that's a good point because Jeff Staney, over there,
I forgot Jeff, but he's done a brilliant job.
And the guys at Q39 and a couple of others, they just can't deny how together they are. I mean,
you talk about the evolution of things. When I was running Plaza III, part of the reason we bought City Light and put it downstairs was I said people come into town. I used to tell people that people would come to Kansas City for three things. They want a Kansas City steak, they want to hear Kansas City jazz, and they want Kansas City barbecue. And I said, I can give you the best steak in town, I can give you the best music in town, and I'll tell you where to get good barbecue. And people would say, where's the best barbecue? I said, if you're in Kansas City and in the barbecue business, it's all good. I said, it's the guy with the coldest beer. But now you've got all these guys. Kansas City, it used to be steaks, and now as the national steakhouses have come in, Kansas City's kind of lost its identity for steak.
Yeah.
But it's become barbecue, and you've got the Jeff Staney's, and you've got the Blind Box guys that just opened out on Shawnee Mission Parkway.
Had a fantastic.
They are good.
Fantastic
really
sandwich
good.
There. Probably the best I've had.
Burn In, and you've got Jack Stack. Jack Fiorello, and now Case Dorman is running that. But Jack Stack is a powerhouse. They'd probably do more international business than anybody. Arthur Bryant's.
The Zarda guy is out in
Zarda's
place,
just, you look at it, you've got Plowboys, you've got, the list is, you got Smoking Guns up north. There's probably, where there used to be all kinds of steakhouses, now there's at least 100 barbecue restaurants that are all world class.
And the one in Westport, we talked
Char
about.
Bar.
Char Bar.
And guys take such pride in Q39. They're getting more, Rob McGee's getting more publicity, and they deserve it because that's become Kansas City's regional food.
There are people who are coming into the steak thing again to try kind of reclaim that territory, because for a while there, and Colby and Megan Geralt's over at Rye down on the plaza, while Rye out south is really a fried chicken place. They're really working to make a name for their steak on the plaza.
Okay.
And then you've got Stock Hill and other places that are focused on steak. But for a while there, I got to tell you, it was getting kind of embarrassing because people would come into town all excited about a steak, and they'd say, where can I go just really get a great steak, guaranteed? And of course you'd have to go,
Applebee's.
Applebee's. No, you'd have to send them over to the Capitol Grill and say, when it was really critical, you just, for a while there, were afraid to know exactly where to send them, because
sure.
a lot of places were kind of inconsistent there. But I think that's changing, because a lot of people have identified that gap, and they're really working hard to fill it.
Well, anything we haven't talked about in this discussion on great restaurants and restaurant management and things like that before we close out?
Well, I think the one thing about Kansas City, and that people need to remember, is that it's got such a great heritage. And when people talk about barbecue, they'll talk about the Kansas City stockyards drove so much history in this town that when people talk about Carolina barbecue, it's all pork. When they talk about Texas barbecue, it's beef. And when you talk about Kansas City, like with jazz, it wasn't the birthplace, but it was the cradle. They nurtured everything. And Kansas City's nurtured a lot of stuff over the years, whether it was where the home of the National Restaurant Association started, or all the independents that made this city great, and all the guys that unfortunately are gone now that we've, but that's evolution. You can't stop that. But it's still such a cool city that, as I've told people, I said, people come in from out of town and they go, what do you do here? And there's so many unique things about Kansas City, the restaurants being part of it, and the people that run them and the people that work in them. And I've told people for years, Kansas City's oceans and mountains, or its neighborhoods and people. It's, it's all about people. And that's the thing that we've got to remember is, as restaurateurs are training people to make those personal connections, and that's the one thing, the young kids, they've got to get off their phones and start engaging with guests. And that's why the high-end restaurants have so many good people. And you go into different places and there's a couple, but it's just about engaging guests and being part of it and making the experience memorable, whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner, because you remember the people. And that's what it's all about. Always has been.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I was in LA for a number of years, I noticed that really, I came back, people would ask me, wow, I bet you see a lot of really innovative concepts in LA and all that. And it's like, well, Kansas City has a lot of innovation, always has. And I think if you looked at which area influenced which, I'd say Kansas City's influence on what was out there on the West Coast was very strong.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because a lot of those concepts came from here. And I still see that kind of invention going on with just different fun things that Joe and I will see as, in our work, consulting restaurants and things. We saw a place last week called Barquet. That's a dog bar restaurant. A lot of innovation there. That was basically the gentleman who started that. That was a zero-base, ground-up, bootstrap project. He just said, hey, people need this. This is fun. I mean, that happens here all the time. So it's an exciting place to be in that business, I think.
Well, years ago, being in Chicago, there was a singer named Bonnie Kolock who used to play at the Earl of Old Town. And she was back in at the restaurant when I was running one downtown. And I said, welcome back to town. She goes, I'd love to come back. She goes, it's great to be home. And she goes, and I'll never forget how she said it. She said, Joe, people on the East Coast think there's nothing west of the Alleghenies. People on the West Coast think there's nothing east of the Sierras. People in the Midwest take the best of everything and leave the nonsense on the coast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly right.
And that was as good a description of living in the Midwest as I'd ever heard.
Good way to put it.
It was great because you've been on both coasts. You've dealt with people you get people that come in from all over. You've done all these stars and all these rock people and all the musicians. And they come and go, God, you guys are so friendly. And it's like, it's just so down there. Everyone's, hey, how are you?
Well, here's what I like to say. Hey, flyover people, keep flying over.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I've driven back and forth to the coast a couple times because my kids live out there, and I'm going like, I can understand why they call it flyover country because there's Lloyd described Kansas City brilliantly one time. He said, it's like a piece of Swiss cheese. There's something and then there's nothing. And there's not enough density sometimes to make things happen, but it's getting closer and closer and it's getting tighter and tighter as people focus on downtown and some of these close-in areas where kids want to live now, and that's what's going to drive Kansas City. It's not, let's see how far south we can go or how far north we can go. Let's see how we can create this energy in this city. But you're right. I mean, it's like if I want something in California, I'll go to California and come back home because.
Well, a lot of the cities reaching critical mass, and so the places are just going crazy. I think wrapping it up, Joe, remember when you first got here and how few places there were.
Oh my God.
And maybe now we got 100 times as many places, easy. Conservatively.
Oh, easy.
And so it's really a heck of an interesting industry.
And there's so much innovation going on that's the brilliant part. I mean, when I got here, couldn't drink on the Kansas side unless you had a club card.
That's right.
Now Kansas is exploding.
Kansas is a lot more fun these days.
It's a lot more fun. Always has been.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, boys. Always a pleasure.
Thanks again to Joe Wilcox, and good luck, Joe and Loy, on your project working with restaurants to make them better. Before we close out, a little salute to the town of Chicago and maybe a new theme song.
Well, come on now, baby, don't you wanna go? Oh, come on, baby, don't you wanna go? See if we can't dodge us some bullets in sweet home Chicago. Well, come on, baby, don't you wanna go? Howdy, hey, now, better get down on the floor. Let all that hot lead fly above you, sweet home Chicago. Well, 1 and 1 is 2, 6 and 2 is 8. You're gonna go out driving, better get some armor plate. Oh, baby, baby, don't you wanna go back to that same old shooting gallery, sweet home Chicago?
Well, we hope things get better there. That's it. And that closes out another Dick and Loy Media and Marketing Mayhem. We'll find somebody new to talk to soon. Hang on.
You might love it, you might hate it. It's my favorite freaking show.